Bolivia, once touted as a socialist haven in Latin America combining economic growth, low inflation, and poverty reduction, now teeters on the edge of economic collapse, leaving observers from around the globe stunned at how the country's golden age unraveled. The combination of mismanagement, miscalculations in natural resource policies, and an over-reliance on fleeting fuel subsidies have plunged the small Andean nation into a severe economic crisis. And while Bolivia's leaders appear unable to grapple with the depth of the calamity, the fallout is reverberating across Latin America, adding to a broader regional malaise. Now, as Bolivia's economic catastrophe deepens, the time to examine the crucial mistakes that led to this collapse grows urgent. From failing to diversify its resource-dependent economy to artificial currency controls, Bolivia's struggle is emblematic of what happens when short-term populist policies overshadow long-term economic planning. It's crucial to start at Bolivia's brief golden era, when the country, under the leadership of President Evo Morales, embarked on an aggressive nationalization campaign aimed at seizing control of its natural gas reserves. The move, initiated in 2006, was celebrated at the time for bringing in much-needed revenue to fund social programs, infrastructure, and public services. During this period, Bolivia enjoyed a boom in natural gas exports, buoyed by high global energy prices, to neighboring countries such as Brazil and Argentina. Between 2006 and 2014, gross domestic product, GDP, rose at an average rate of 5%, poverty levels receded from 60% to 38%, and the country enjoyed some of the lowest inflation rates in the region. The once sleepy capital, La Paz, embarked on several emblematic projects. A 19-mile cable car network was constructed to traverse the city's steep valleys, new infrastructure projects dotted the skyline, and public spending skyrocketed. By all measures, Bolivia seemed like the socialist success story Latin American leaders had long been hoping for. But herein lies the first hint at impending disaster. Bolivia, in its ambitious gas-fueled rise, repeated a classical mistake of resource-dependent economies, misplanning for the future. The country failed to reinvest adequately in gas reserves, neglected exploration, and, most crucially, overestimated the longevity of its gas wealth. According to Bolivia's former Energy and Hydrocarbons Minister, Franklin Molina Ortiz, the government thought they had unearthed a Qatar of gas. The perpetuation of this myth allowed complacency to take over. While enjoying the bonanza of rapidly rising energy prices, Bolivia didn't look critically enough at its foundational error: unsustainable policies based on a finite resource. This oversupply optimism led Bolivia down the path Venezuela had tread: inflated fiscal spending without sufficient concern for market volatility or production declines. By the time the global commodity price downturn hit in 2014, Bolivia's reliance on natural gas came under immense pressure. Global demand weakened, and energy giants, having paid their taxes and royalties to the state, refrained from making additional investments. That was because Morales' nationalization of the gas sector, while politically popular, had deterred international oil majors from reinvesting in exploration or new fields. For multinational corporations such as Total Energies SE, Repsol SA, and Petrobras SA, it was no longer feasible to take part in the long-term development of Bolivia's energy assets. To make matters worse, Bolivia's domestic gas demand skyrocketed as the government continued subsidizing fuel for citizens, making gasoline as affordable as 54 cents per liter, cheaper than in Saudi Arabia. This subsidy, while a social lifeline for many Bolivians, placed a heavy burden on the country's finances. As production fell, Bolivia was forced to rely on costly fuel imports while keeping energy prices artificially low for its citizens. By 2022, Bolivia, once a proud natural gas exporter, became a net energy importer, the very opposite of the gas giant leadership had envisioned. A significant piece of Bolivia's economic disaster lies in its addiction to fuel subsidies. Like many Latin American nations, Bolivia was lured by the politically attractive idea of subsidizing fuel to keep its population placated. And, in the depths of past economic crisis, such policies have allowed leaders to stave off revolutions by earning short-term goodwill. However, Bolivia's scheme to offer gasoline at below-market prices eventually led to disastrous consequences, draining the country's scant foreign reserves and opening up a large fiscal deficit. These subsidies are now seen as an anchor dragging the economy into insolvency. From an economic perspective, these subsidies could have been gradually minimized during years of growth. Yet successive administrations hesitated to gamble with the political peril of raising fuel prices. Even former President Morales thought he could pull back in 2010, attempting to remove some subsidies, but was promptly met by protests and civil unrest that made him back down. Current President Luis Arce, a former technocrat handpicked by Morales, seems willing to employ the same temporary band-aid. Despite the dire warnings of economists about runaway inflation and a spiraling deficit, Arce continues to subsidize fuel at 54 cents per liter. The risk of an inflationary spiral looms large, as rising external debt, a black market for US dollars, and capital flight constrain every aspect of Bolivia's economic policy. Another unspoken cause of Bolivia's crisis is its unsustainably maintained exchange rate. Since 2011, Bolivia has kept the Boliviano, the national currency, pegged to the USD at an artificial rate of between 6.86 to 6.96 Boliviano per dollar. Despite mounting pressures, the government has been reluctant to allow devaluation, fearing inflation and social unrest. However, the lack of foreign reserves, exacerbated by the fuel subsidies, has led to a critical shortage of US dollars. Without balance of payment support, the black market for dollars has grown significantly. Today, it costs over 10 Boliviano to buy $1 on the street, nearly 45% higher than the official exchange rate. For families depending on remittances or parents sending money to their children studying abroad, this currency crisis has become intolerable. The middle and upper classes in La Paz are struggling to wire much-needed funds overseas due to stringent capital controls, often reduced to navigating complex bureaucracies to get limited sums approved. In one harrowing example, a Bolivian student studying in South Korea was forced to go for 2 days without food as their family back home struggled to transfer dollars abroad. The frustration is palpable for citizens across socio-economic classes, raising further questions about the government's ability to manage its economic policy efficiently. Bolivia's economic woes cannot be analyzed in isolation. The country's unraveling reflects an all-too-familiar problem across the region. The widespread mismanagement of natural resources, combined with the false promise of populist policies promising economic salvation, has plunged many Latin American economies into crisis. Argentina, Bolivia's next-door neighbor, now sees over half of its population living below the poverty line. Hyperinflation, currency collapses, and political instability have pushed Argentina into an economic freefall under the leadership of both conservative and leftist governments. Brazil, which once shared Bolivia's energy boom, also finds itself plagued by social unrest, inequality, and slow growth under right-wing and left-wing coalitions alike. Ecuador, too, is gripped by a wave of violence as drug cartels have eroded the state's ability to maintain law and order. Similarly, Venezuela remains locked in its own deep-seated crisis caused by many of the same issues present in Bolivia: unchecked nationalization of resources, corrupt governance, and dependency on a disappearing oil revenue lifeline. Nicolas Maduro's repressive regime stifles dissent while poverty escalates. What we are witnessing in Bolivia is yet another instance of a fragile resource-dependent state overextending its social policies during boom times, only to face calamity during downturns. And with Bolivia being one of the region's last socialist holdouts, the lessons learned are harsh. Populism without fiscal moderation leads to unsustainable policies, which ultimately invite economic ruin. If Bolivia continues down this path, the country's collapse could exacerbate the deepening migration crisis. Already, Bolivia's faltering economy is contributing to the flood of migrants throughout the Americas, pushing northward under deteriorating conditions. This migration adds a further layer of strain on neighboring nations already battling their own fiscal crises, creating a long-term threat to North-South relationships. Despite the seemingly bleak outlook, it would be short-sighted to write Bolivia off just yet. The country stands upon a geological treasure trove, holding some of the largest lithium reserves in the world. In a world shifting toward electric vehicles and renewable energy, lithium has become one of the hottest commodities, and many analysts have posed the question: why hasn't Bolivia capitalized on this massive untapped resource? Although Bolivia's lithium reserves are among the largest on the planet, the country suffers from a lack of technology and infrastructure to fully exploit them. Arce has already entered into deals with countries like Russia, and Chinese firms have been contracted to explore these reserves. However, critics point out that Bolivia bypassed deals with more experienced US and European firms that could have spurred faster development. If Bolivia can successfully monetize lithium and begin ramping up renewable energy production, including its biodiesel projects set to come online by 2026, it might be able to alleviate some of the economic pressure it is currently experiencing. President Luis Arce has highlighted projects like the development of biodiesel plants which could recycle household cooking oil into diesel, helping to reduce Bolivia's dependence on imported fuel. Arce has promised that these efforts would substitute up to 60% of the country's diesel consumption by the end of 2026. An ambitious target, but one that could play a decisive role in shoring up the Bolivian economy. However, multiple roadblocks stand in the way of this recovery plan. While Arce's government touts the upcoming production from a mega gas field, expected to deliver in 2026, economists, including Diego von Vacano of Texas A&M University, caution that the field is not yet commercially viable. This skepticism reflects the general hesitancy of experts regarding the administration's growth forecasts. The concerns are not limited to just oil and gas. Bolivia's ability to industrialize and scale its lithium production remains questionable. Despite initial enthusiasm and heavy government rhetoric, little progress has been made in tapping into the $1.4 trillion worth of lithium Bolivia is estimated to possess beneath its vast salt flats. The management of Bolivia's lithium reserves tells a frustrating tale of missed opportunities. While neighboring countries like Chile and Argentina have been reaping the benefits of their lithium deposits, Bolivia, despite having the largest reserves in the world, has been sitting on what could have been a golden ticket toward economic diversification and an industrial leap forward. So, why has Bolivia lagged so far behind in capitalizing on its lithium reserves? While the lack of infrastructure and technology is a commonly cited reason, deeper systemic issues are also at play, most notably governmental corruption and over-bureaucratization. For years, Bolivia's state apparatus, compounded by ideological leanings that prioritized political loyalty over meritocratic management, has failed to implement a coherent, long-term plan to fully exploit its battery metals base. Many see the Morales-era policies, particularly when it comes to foreign investment partnerships, as a key area where Bolivia went wrong. Morales, in his determination to nationalize resources and avoid foreign interferences, turned away suitors from Western nations, including U.S. and European companies, which many argue could have accelerated lithium development. Instead, the government struck deals with less experienced Russian firms, whose involvement has so far borne little fruit. There is a vast gulf between political promises and actual capacity to deliver on those promises. As Bolivia's lithium management remains mired in inefficiency and corruption, it runs the significant risk of repeating its resource curse with gas. Already, much of South America is advancing in its lithium sectors. Chile stands as an example, with its well-structured partnerships with multinational mining corporations, keeping the revenues flowing and technological progress accelerating. In contrast, Bolivia remains stuck in its populist approach, bogged down by state-run institutions and cronyism that have not proven able to capitalize on its strong resource base. By channeling its fears of imperialism and exploitation into rigid, inflexible policies, Bolivia may be sealing its economic fate. Another resource boom that delivers little to the broader population because of poor governance and a failure to create a favorable investment climate. While Bolivia's obsession with hydrocarbons and, to a lesser extent, lithium has dominated the news, it's essential to acknowledge that the country is not without other opportunities. Agriculture, if properly mechanized and expanded, could potentially be a significant growth factor for the economy. Bolivia holds geographically diverse land that could be harnessed for food production, which, in times of global food insecurity, could prove to be a crucial asset. Another major area that remains untapped is Bolivia's tourism potential. The country is home to rich archaeological sites, from pre-Columbian Tiwanaku to the colonial heart of cities like Potosi, once a pillar of the colonial Spanish Empire's silver trade. The stunning uni-salt flats, vast mountain ranges, rainforests, and unique cultural blends all make Bolivia a potential tourism goldmine. Yet, tourism remains underdeveloped, owing largely to poor infrastructure, political unrest, and safety concerns. But again, the big question revolves around whether Bolivia's government has the political stability and foresight to make the reforms necessary for economic diversification. Diversification requires significant investment in education, infrastructure, and law enforcement to make the country attractive to international tourists and viable for industrial agriculture. However, with Bolivia's fiscal deficit skyrocketing and the Arce administration laser-focused on the resource sector. Attempts to spur diversification through agriculture, tourism, and green energy initiatives have so far remained more rhetoric than reality. If the economic challenges facing Bolivia are daunting, they are matched only by the political turmoil that continues to deepen as the country inches closer to full-blown crisis. President Arce faces increasing political pressure, both from the unrest evolving in the streets and the fracturing within his own MAS, Movement for Socialism party. Arce's position is threatened in part by his former mentor, Evo Morales, who continues to retain significant influence within MAS despite his ousting in 2019 following accusations of election fraud. Morales has consistently criticized Arce's handling of the economy and accused him of cowardice in failing to stand up to opposition forces, as Morales once did. The division between the Morales camp and Arce's more pragmatic faction within MAS complicates governance. While Arce faces the task of rolling back unsustainable policies, such as the fuel subsidies Morales enacted, he must do so without alienating a base that still holds Morales in reverence. The bitter internal divisions don't merely threaten Arce's control, they also increase the likelihood of paralysis in government. Facing an agitated public as discontent boils over due to inflation, shortages, and lines at fuel pumps, Arce increasingly resorts to measures reminiscent of autocratic rule by executive fiat. His military orders to the border to secure subsidized goods, particularly fuel and foodstuffs, from being smuggled out of the country highlights a government scrambling for stopgaps, rather than structural solutions to a currency crisis and economic imbalances. The coming elections in 2025 are an ominous date circled on Bolivia's calendar. There is growing speculation that Arce might not survive politically until then. Accusations began swirling in 2023, with allegations that Arce attempted to stage a coup to consolidate power, further inflaming an already fragile political environment. While Arce denies these allegations, the political stagnation combined with an economic collapse is a recipe for further civil unrest. Bolivia's financial dilemma brings to light the broader global debate surrounding fuel subsidies. Across the planet, politically embattled nations have found themselves trapped by the same problem. Cheap fuel for the public is a politically expedient but fiscally unsustainable policy. Last year alone, global governments spent a whopping $616 billion on fuel subsidies, according to the International Energy Agency, IEA. In Argentina, Ecuador, Nigeria, Iran, and Venezuela, similar patterns of fiscal destruction can be seen, where politically popular fuel subsidies provided momentary relief but resulted in eventual fiscal collapse. For example, Argentina's spiraling debt problem is inextricably tied to its government's inability to wean the public off subsidized fuel and utilities. Venezuela's gigantic oil reserves, once the envy of the developed world, have gone untapped and frittered away due to corruption and subsidies that destroyed PDVSA, the national oil company. Even Iran, despite its hydrocarbon wealth, has long struggled with the debilitating costs of subsidized fuel, which contribute both to budget deficits and periodic mass protests. The lesson from Bolivia for these countries is clear. Fuel subsidies, while politically popular, offer only fleeting relief and quickly become an economic straitjacket. While poverty alleviation and making fuel affordable for low-income populations is an understandable objective, without gradual reforms, these subsidies inevitably pressure foreign exchange reserves and enhance fiscal deficits. When administered without proper financial planning, subsidies become poison pills rather than safety nets. Countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which have successfully managed to reform their fuel subsidy programs, chart a potential path for Bolivia. Phased price hikes, targeted subsidies for the poor, and the reinvestment of saved capital into education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Otherwise, Bolivia risks following the same path of unsustainable dependence rather than attacking the structural issues head-on. International financial institutions, IFIs, have not been silent on the issue. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank have raised alarm over unsustainable fiscal deficits, resulting in several national disasters. For Bolivia, the IMF has long flagged the danger posed by its wide fiscal deficit coupled with depleting forex reserves. Bolivia's foreign reserves plunged from a peak $15 billion in 2014 to under $4 billion in early 2023, a catastrophic decline that leaves it deeply vulnerable to external shocks. Hyperinflation looms large on the horizon, as the government is forced to reckon with ballooning debt, and an artificial exchange rate that will soon be untenable. Should the Boliviano sharply devalue, as many experts predict, Bolivia might face the kind of crippling inflation wave that has already paralyzed its neighbors like Venezuela and Argentina. Economists broadly agree that Bolivia should initiate a gradual elimination of fuel subsidies, as well as float its exchange rate. These are tough pills to swallow, but doing so can help stabilize the economy, restore confidence among investors, and reduce social instability in the long term. But politically, these steps carry great risk. Any moves towards adjustment have triggered large-scale protests and unrest in the past, most notably during Morales' term, leading to a swift retreat from policy reforms that Bolivia desperately needed. President Luis Arce now sits at this exact crossroads. Essentially, he must choose between pushing for painful but necessary market-based reforms or continuing the populist policies that have driven his country into fiscal chaos. The political cost of either option looms large, and with Bolivia already showing signs of widespread disillusionment, any misstep could hasten the current government's collapse. A key element of this economic narrative is Bolivia's escalating currency crisis. With foreign reserves exhausted and the government clinging to an increasingly untenable fixed exchange rate, the economy hovers on the brink of hyperinflation. As mentioned earlier, while the official exchange rate of the Boliviano remains between 6.86 and 6.96 per dollar, the black market rate has reached alarmingly higher levels, topping 10 Boliviano per US dollar. This discrepancy signals a lack of faith in the government's ability to maintain stability and creates opportunities for profiteers to exploit the situation. Bolivia could fall into the trap of uncontrolled money printing, following the perilous path taken by countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. In both cases, hyperinflation spun out of control, wiping out people's savings, plunging large portions of the population into poverty, and creating widespread social upheaval. Venezuela's inflation reached figures above 1 million% in 2018, destroying the real value of salaries and making essential goods unaffordable for most citizens. If Bolivia's inflation suppresses savings value in a similarly drastic way, the result could be catastrophic for the Bolivian middle class, already struggling with volatile exchange rates and limits on remittance outflows. Arce's government has so far resisted IMF and World Bank pressure to devalue the Boliviano, fearing the immense political backlash that could follow. However, without external funding or a sudden boost in exports, Bolivia will likely be forced to resort to devaluation sooner rather than later. That devaluation may spark a dangerous cycle of inflation as the price of essential imported goods, particularly fuel, skyrockets. To mitigate such risks, Bolivia needs more than short-term controls. It needs economic transformation. Arce has suggested using cryptocurrencies as an alternative hedge against the Boliviano's weakness, but this plan seems short-sighted and detached from the everyday realities of average citizens. There is no meaningful infrastructure in Bolivia to support cryptocurrency adoption on a wide scale, and the risk of wild cryptocurrency price fluctuations adds yet another layer of uncertainty for a population already battling economic hardship. The economic problems Bolivia faces are not just abstract figures about debt, inflation, or exchange rates. They have a devastating human cost. Already, major respondents in Bolivia claim that rising inflation, unemployment, and scarcity are sparking anxiety across the population. Middle-class families struggling to send remittances to children studying overseas is just one facet of the broad economic stress now afflicting the nation. Bolivia's poverty line, which had seen years of steady reductions from the early 2000s through the late 2010s, is again on an upward trend. The combination of stagnant household incomes and limited access to essential services is hitting the poorest in society the hardest. At $405 a month, Bolivia's national average income has fallen below the 2015 level, and for many working-class Bolivians, the idea of saving or acquiring real estate in the country's previously booming urban centers has slipped further from reality. One of the most troubling aspects of Bolivia's ongoing crisis involves food shortages. Long lines snake around state-run grocery stores where locals now gather to purchase subsidized food items. The government's near-complete control of food distribution in some areas has amplified frustrations, with limited supply and price controls making basic goods harder to come by. As social tensions rise, people are turning their anger on the government, whose mishandling of economic affairs is now beyond question. Isolated protests have been a common feature of the past several months, but there's mounting pressure for larger-scale demonstrations and strikes. Truckers, vendors, and civil society groups, all of whom bear the brunt of the crisis, are turning to street protests in a bid to force the Arce government to address their grievances. A larger wave of unrest could paralyze Bolivia, further destabilizing a fragile nation. To add further volatility, Bolivia's transport sector, crucial in a mountainous country reliant on trucking to move goods between cities, has been especially hit hard by the fuel shortages. As truckers increasingly resort to protests and threats of roadblocks, critical infrastructure such as highways and border crossings are at risk of being shut down, effectively isolating parts of the country from one another. In a nation where mountainous geography already hinders the movement of goods, long-term strikes would deepen supply chain disruptions, exacerbating the already severe shortage of food and vital supplies. All the economic upheaval now challenges the core narrative that bolstered the Bolivian socialist success story. Between the years of 2006 and 2014, Bolivia's governing philosophy brought genuine poverty reduction and improved access to services, justifying Evo Morales' popularity during this period. Now, with hunger, fuel lines, and hyperinflation threatening to define the current moment, the Bolivian socialist dream has become a harsh nightmare for the average citizen. With mounting poverty, unemployment, and social instability, Bolivia's role in the larger Latin American migrant crisis is intensifying. Similar to what we have witnessed in Venezuela, Bolivia's deteriorating situation has begun to push thousands of its citizens to pursue work or refuge in neighboring nations. For countries already facing their own economic turmoil, such as Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, this bolsters a growing wave of disillusionment and migrant-driven social tensions across the region. The broader Latin American migrant crisis is indeed one of the largest human exoduses in recent memory. According to the United Nations, more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country since 2015 due to economic collapse and political repression. With Bolivia potentially following in these footsteps, the regional implications are profound. Neighboring countries, already struggling with their own issues, like Argentina's record-high inflation rates and political volatility, now face an incoming wave of Bolivian migrants. Meanwhile, Bolivia's southern neighbors, like Argentina, face their own socio-economic calamity. Desperation drives individuals to emigrate, particularly to the US and Europe, with hopes of securing better living conditions. The burden this places on host nations is immense, contributing to a mounting humanitarian toll across the Americas. As Bolivia falters, this outflux won't just be the poor. The educated middle class, who can still afford to make moves, will take their skills to more developed nations, further reducing Bolivia's ability to innovate or diversify down the line. Brain drain compounds the problems of a stagnating economy, leaving behind a populace disproportionately skewed toward those stuck in survival mode. The possible long-term consequences of this crisis could resemble those seen in Venezuela. The development of a transnational, displaced population that lacks citizenship recognition or access to basic services in other countries. If this occurs, Bolivia's crisis is no longer just its own. It becomes a regional issue. As Bolivia tries to quit its fuel dependency and move to cleaner, more sustainable industries like lithium, it enters a new geopolitical arena where global powers are already vying for control. With the rise of electric vehicles and renewable energy solutions, countries like China, the US, and Russia have been increasingly eyeing Bolivia's lithium reserves as the new oil, a commodity with global strategic importance. However, despite signing contracts with foreign firms to exploit lithium, Bolivia's inability to fully tap into this resource reflects deeper geopolitical tensions at play. China has made significant inroads in Latin America, seeking to dominate the region's upstream resource extraction in exchange for infrastructure investment or favorable loans. Russia's involvement adds further complexity, particularly given its lack of track record when it comes to refining lithium for battery production. Bolivia seems to be caught between the competing interests of these powers, and its choices in the coming years will determine who ultimately benefits from its resource boom, if indeed that boom ever happens. Given that Bolivia passed over potentially more experienced Western firms in preference to those from countries like Russia and China, many analysts worry that Bolivia might lose out on long-term investment. The geopolitics of lithium will reshape Bolivia's economic future in profound ways. While Arce's government is full of promises about the potential for a lithium boom, skepticism persists. Will Bolivia be able to move fast enough to cash in on high lithium prices before more efficient competitors like Chile and Australia gain even more market dominance? Furthermore, will aligning with Russia and China, instead of more experienced and transparent Western firms, hinder progress? As we look ahead, the question remains, is there a path to recovery for Bolivia? Or are we witnessing a slow-motion descent into the kind of economic dystopia that has plagued Venezuela for the past decade? First, it's clear that Bolivia must act decisively on economic reform. Despite President Arce's reluctance, cutting fuel subsidies gradually will be a key step toward relieving the strain on public coffers. Ecuador's example of phasing out fuel subsidies while introducing targeted cash transfers to the poorest should serve as a model. Allowing the Boliviano to float and seeking external lines of credit might trigger temporary pain, but these moves also offer the quickest route to stabilizing the currency and reviving foreign investment. Second, Bolivia must diversify beyond hydrocarbons. It's essential to get serious about mining and exporting lithium in a transparent, efficient, and competitive format. Bolivia needs to open up to experienced international consortiums and partners who can help it scale up its renewable energy resources in a globally competitive way. Long-term economic planning, stable regulatory frameworks, and partnerships with transparent, experienced multinational corporations are crucial if Bolivia is to develop its vast reserves of lithium and other minerals in a globally competitive and environmentally responsible manner. However, if the government continues to favor deals with less experienced or politically aligned firms, especially from countries like Russia, it risks falling even further behind in an industry dominated by more efficient players like Chile and Australia. The country's technological capacity is far from industrial-scale extraction of lithium, and to change this, foreign expertise and investment are needed. Without such a shift, Bolivia will once again miss out on capitalizing on a critical resource that the world increasingly demands. Bolivia also needs to prioritize infrastructure development and human capital investment. Energy policy mismanagement highlights a broader failure to invest strategically. Modernizing transportation, boosting agricultural production, and fostering the tourism sector are all potential avenues for economic diversification that could reduce Bolivia's dependence on hydrocarbons. The tourism sector, in particular, could thrive if the nation addressed safety, infrastructure, and accessibility issues, making its natural and cultural treasures, such as the Uni Salt Flats, a magnet for international visitors. Furthermore, structural reforms, especially reducing cronyism, cutting down red tape, and fostering a business-friendly environment, are preconditions for real change. The government must abandon the zero-sum political game that favors particular factions, or Bolivia will be stuck in a cycle where only temporary fixes and superficial reforms are implemented while deeper, broader issues remain unsolved. If Bolivia truly wants to attract serious, long-term investment in non-extractive industries, it needs to guarantee the rule of law, create robust institutions that facilitate investment, and ensure that capital isn't scared away by unpredictable government policies or shifting regulatory frameworks. At this stage, Bolivia has an opportunity to learn from other countries that have successfully diversified their economies or are treading similar paths of recovery amid crisis. For example, Indonesia's approach to reforming fuel subsidies, gradually raising fuel prices while providing cash transfers to the country's poorest, could serve as a blueprint as Bolivia attempts to unwind its deeply entrenched and unsustainable subsidy system. Indonesia's success rested on the government's ability to communicate the necessity of the reforms effectively and transparently, boosting trust in institutions and avoiding the populist backlash that so many governments fear. Similarly, Malaysia's clever balancing of natural resource wealth and industrial development shows how a resource-dependent economy can transition toward larger goals by encouraging private investment, while at the same time protecting state interests in key sectors. Malaysia has built a sustainable resource extraction policy that includes environmental protections, skilled workforce development, and wise management of state-controlled enterprises, without resorting to the heavy-handed nationalization strategies that typically scare away foreign capital. On the other hand, Bolivia must avoid falling into the same traps that Venezuela and Nigeria have, where nationalized oil industries, rampant corruption, and structural mismanagement have led to stagnation and poverty. Venezuela, a textbook case of mismanaging abundant natural resources, once the wealthiest country in Latin America, remains ensnared in a decades-long economic collapse because of its inability to diversify away from oil and its government's refusal to enact necessary structural reforms. The Venezuelan example highlights the dangers of resource dependency, fiscal irresponsibility, and unchecked populism. Similarly, Nigeria's failed forays into fuel subsidies underscore the global challenges Bolivia faces. Politically expedient but economically disastrous. Persisting with subsidies becomes a quick way toward empty public coffers and inflated expectations that the state cannot forever satisfy. As the world moves toward renewables, Bolivia has a golden opportunity to position itself as a significant player, but time is running out. The growing demand for batteries, electric vehicles, and renewable storage technologies places lithium at the center of global energy plans. Bolivia's untapped lithium, along with its potential for wind, solar, and hydro development, could make it a regional leader in green energy. Assuming the government can mobilize sufficient investment and create a favorable policy environment. However, competition is fierce. Chile and Argentina are already powerhouses in the lithium market. These countries, despite having only a fraction of Bolivia's potential reserves, have capitalized on their lithium deposits and secured valuable global market shares, creating stable industries that attract steady foreign investment and develop infrastructure. Their foresight in opening to international firms, rather than defaulting to half-baked nationalization policies, has enabled them to capitalize on the global shift toward green energy. Meanwhile, Bolivia, which boasts the world's largest lithium reserves, has yet to fully realize any meaningful scale of production. This could change with the right policies. If Bolivia establishes itself as a responsible steward of both its land and people by implementing environmentally friendly, socially responsible mining strategies, it could win confidence globally. Moving forward, Bolivia needs effective, transparent regulations that guarantee not only competitive prices, but social and environmental accountability. That could allow the country to access needed foreign investment without sacrificing national interests or eroding trust domestically. Finally, developing lithium technologies beyond simple extraction should be a national priority. Bolivia could invest in creating its own lithium battery production capacity, leveraging domestic expertise or partnerships with technologically advanced countries. Creating jobs and industries within Bolivia itself would mirror Argentina's efforts to internalize lithium benefits and avoid the typical boom-bust cycle that accompanies raw material extraction. Bolivia's current default mode in managing its economic crisis resembles constant firefighting, jumping from one short-term issue to another without focusing on strategic planning and durable reforms. However, to secure a sustainable future, this approach must give way to more sophisticated and comprehensive economic policymaking. In the short term, President Luis Arce must confront the reality of an unsustainable budget, which is hemorrhaging from fuel subsidies, and move toward more efficient social spending. As previously discussed, targeted cash transfers could soften the blow for low-income citizens, decreasing dependency on subsidies while maintaining the government's commitment to social equity. Bolivia has some room for error, but pushing these reforms later into Arce's tenure risks damaging his legacy further and narrowing his options to navigate out of a fiscal cul-de-sac. Next, the government needs to engineer a controlled currency devaluation. By introducing a more flexible exchange rate, Bolivia can stop hemorrhaging foreign reserves, create market confidence, and potentially avoid the hyperinflation that accompanies an uncontrolled currency crisis. While devaluing a currency often sparks domestic price hikes for imported goods, particularly fuel, the long-term benefits of allowing market forces more breathing room outweigh the short-term political pain. Economic diversification represents the only real long-term solution. Bolivia must break free from its historic reliance on gas and fossil fuels, instead fostering industries like agribusiness, tourism, renewable energy, and tech to create a more resilient economy. Expanding capacity in sectors such as forestry, light manufacturing, or services could offer Bolivia insulation from future commodity price volatility by broadening its income base. Human capital development, especially in education and vocational training, must also be prioritized. Countries like South Korea managed economic transformations largely thanks to massive state investments in education and skills training. Bolivia needs to educate and train its youth, creating an agile workforce proficient in the skills necessary for next-generation industries. Without this focus, the country's efforts to diversify away from the resource sector will stumble repeatedly. Bolivia's escalating economic crisis presents a stark cautionary tale, not just for the Andean region, but for all nations excessively reliant on non-renewable resources while placing short-term political goals ahead of long-term stability. At its heart, Bolivia's downfall arose from the deceptively alluring tides of resource wealth. Gas, once viewed as Bolivia's ticket to prosperity, became a crutch rather than a stepping stone for broader economic resilience. This economic collapse, compounded by mismanagement in the political arena, highlights a simple but pivotal lesson. No single resource or subsidy can sustain a nation perpetually. Effective governance means sensing and making tough decisions in good times, not waiting for crises to arise from delayed or ignored reforms. The longer Bolivia delays meaningful action, especially on subsidies, currency reform, and diversification, the more likely it is to endure a drawn-out, decades-long fall similar to Venezuela. Countries across Latin America and beyond should take note. Resource wealth is no panacea. Diversification, strategic partnerships, and transparent governance are essential to protecting against the boom-bust cycle of commodity dependence. Moreover, strengthening the rule of law, reducing dependence on politically convenient but ultimately damaging subsidies, building human capital, and integrating into global renewable markets represent key ingredients for stabilizing and developing Bolivia moving forward. For Bolivia, the 2025 elections may prove a watershed moment. Whether it continues on its current path toward economic self-destruction, or whether it changes course in favor of necessary reforms and a greater vision, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the window for Bolivia to correct its trajectory is closing fast. The actions taken in the next 2 to 3 years will likely define the fate of this resource-rich but floundering Andean nation for decades to come.